So yesterday I told the story of when I was at Mampukuji, and a friend introduced me to the poet Gary Snyder, and we became buddies. And then later in a presentation here in the United States at a university, someone asked him, "Who can save the world?" And he gave a typical Zen answer. He said, well, I can't tell you who that person is, but I can tell you something about that person. It's going to be someone who doesn't need to save the world. And he sort of left it at that. Mm-hmm. So what did he mean by that? Someone who doesn't need to save the world. Let me see if I can fill in some of the details, because it's actually a very deep issue. This path, contemplative-based psychospiritual growth, is how I think of this path. It's universal. You find it all over the planet, East, West, prehistoric, historic times. There's an underlying commonality, which, if you think about it, is utterly extraordinary, considering the enormous variation in culture, language, race, and so forth, that is this planet, East, West, ancient, modern. Prehistoric, actually, when I say ancient. Stone Age, our remote ancestors. So there is this very human thing, this universal human thing, that I call contemplative-based psychospiritual growth. It represents a radical re-engineering of our humanity. So, I mean, I like to present things, as you know, sort of in a light, humorous way. And the reason is because this is actually such a heavy-duty, industrial strength process. So it's nice to be light and humorous about it and not take ourselves too seriously. But actually, it is very heavy-duty. My phrase is, it represents a fundamental re-engineering of who we are. And I'm going to guess that it's the next step in evolution, although obviously no one can know that. But if you look at how evolution has proceeded hitherto, it's through natural selection at a biological level. And we are the beneficiaries of that process. Eventually, that process, it took millions and millions of years, but that process produced an amazingly intelligent species on this planet, at least relative to the intelligence of the previous species. Now, yes, there's other quite intelligent species, elephants, porpoises, other great apes, and so forth. But when you look at our brains, there's just an amazing difference at a physical level. So we're smart. And I think that we're smart enough to figure out that there's a couple little flaws in our engineering. The other species have to just wait for the Darwinian time scale, which is mega years. millions of years for natural selection, or certainly tens of thousands of years for natural selection to mold through expansion and contraction, life and death, mold their evolution. But apparently, and once again, this is conjectural on my part, but apparently natural selection has finally produced a species smart enough to actually realize that there are flaws. The entire European tradition, at least post-pagan Europe, the Christian tradition, is based on that paradigm. And whether or not one accepts the story, the Greek word for story being mythos, okay, whether or not you accept the myth or the story, you cannot argue with the logic that there's something wrong. Look out at the world. Something's not quite right. Now, now you can say, and we will say, that there is a primordial okayness also. But on the surface, there's some problems, which sort of makes sense when you think about it, because very complex creatures like us can develop problems. Our own strengths become our weaknesses. We have this incredibly advanced immune system to defend us. But then what happens? It commonly creates an inflammatory response that kills us. Inflammation is our defenses sort of overworking, overreacting. Septic shock can do you in. So there's something a little off in the engineering. We're real smart, so we have real big heads, which is sort of nice, but unfortunately they're now too big to come out of the mother conveniently. So the birthing process is very, very difficult for our species. It's an engineering flaw. Well, we sort of took care of that with modern obstetrics and so forth. We benefit from bipedalism. We could walk upright, but we get a lot of lower back problems. So, it's great, but Darwin is not perfect. We have this intelligence, but unfortunately, moment by moment, before the rational brain gets activated, another part of the brain called the limbic system, the amygdala, the nucleus accumbens, and other emotional structures, they get activated first. So that our rationality is neuroanatomically colored by emotionality. So we have the situation of having this advanced primate brain, and in the center of it is essentially the worldview of a Komodo dragon. And if you've ever seen any videos about Komodo dragons, their society is not a kind one. There's some possible problem here. In the neuroscience field, there have been numerous imaging studies watching people's brains react to politicians. And it absolutely does not matter what your politics are. When you listen to the other, your emotional brain lights up and your rational brain just shuts down. It's expansion and contraction. So, not surprising, huh? What happens, given that that's sort of how we're engineered. So, good news is we're smart enough to figure this all out. I just said it. We're smart enough to figure it out, and we're smart enough to correct it. And the way that that has been done hitherto is certainly a lot faster than Darwin, but maybe not as fast as we would like, because you've probably noticed it takes years and decades typically, although we get benefits right away, otherwise people would never come back after the first retreat. We do get benefits right away, but those of you that have hung in for the duration know that in general, God saves the best for last. The really, really mind-boggling dramatic changes tend to happen after a lifetime of practice. What? Well, happiness independent of conditions, which is pretty awesome. So that's pretty quick. So it's a radical re-engineering, and who knows what the next few centuries will bring. Maybe as we partner with science, we'll be able to accelerate things by an order of magnitude. I've got a friend at Google. Some of you probably have read his books, Jetmeng Tan, T-A-N, known as Meng to his friends. That's the weird Chaozhou dialect of Chinese. He's Singaporean Chinese. I call him Chun. His last name is Chun in Mandarin, Chun Yiming. It's a really cool name, actually. It comes out Jetmeng in his dialect, but Yiming in Mandarin. It means like one voice. One voice that shakes the world. It's from Buddhism. It's a Buddhist term. Anyway, because he's a Google engineer, he started this search inside yourself thing. Some of you are probably aware of. So his thing is 10x, okay? Stream entry 10x. So stream entry is the traditional Theravada term for initial enlightenment, and 10x means he wants to engineer it so it's 10 times quicker for all humans, and we have 10 times as many of them. Well, maybe we'll have 1,000 or 1,000,000 times as many of them. Who knows? Can't say about the future. But it is a radical re-engineering of who we are. So who are we? Well, from an engineer's point of view, we're an input-output system. We have sensory input. We have behavioral output. The sensory input reflects objective conditions. The behavioral output impacts objective conditions. And in between, we have inner and outer sensory experience. I like to classify it in terms of inner and outer see, hear, feel, with the inner see, hear, feel creating the core sense of or associated with the core sense of I amness. So Part of the re-engineering, the radical re-engineering, I talked about yesterday. On the sensory side, the ability to have complete experience allows us to experience discomfort with less and less suffering, and it allows us to experience pleasure with more and more fulfillment. So that that has an impact on our behavior. Normally, behavior is driven by suffering and frustration. So suffering is physical and or emotional pain that is not experienced fully. So sensorially that causes suffering, and in terms of what we do, say, and think in the world, our behavior, it causes a drivenness in the behavior. Flip side, when pleasure fails to deliver the full potential for fulfillment, it turns into what might be described as frustration or craving. Same thing. The experience of a craving in the moment is just an experience of an incomplete pleasure. You may have heard the notion that the impurities are pure. What the hell does that mean? Well, it actually means something very, very deep and important. It's not just an enigmatic thing that someone said in order to blow your mind or get your attention. When you have a craving for some pleasure, you could have a mental image of the pleasure, you could have some mental talk that says, hey, I want this, but you actually get a little taste, a memory of the physical pleasure, and more importantly, emotional pleasures, a rosiness in the chest, a little hint of smile on the face, a frisson of excitement going up your back. Very, very subtle pleasure is present in that moment in the sensory experience of desire. If you are able to complete that pleasure, then that pleasure, the pleasure that is part of the sensory gestalt of the moment of desire, then that pleasure will give you complete fulfillment. The pleasure in the desire will fulfill the desire. If that doesn't happen, then the desire becomes a desire that drives sensory experience because you're not satisfied yet. That was pretty subtle and complex. But driven behavior, need, is associated with physical and or emotional discomfort that has turned into suffering, and or physical and or emotional pleasure that was too subtle to complete, was so subtle that you couldn't experience it fully enough to fulfill you right then and there. And now we're driven. So there is need. Half of the radical re-engineering of this process is sensorially the reduction of suffering and the elevation of fulfillment. But that is linked behaviorally to the re-engineering of driven behavior into what, for lack of any official word, I might call motivated or dynamic behavior. I think it's very important that the result of our practice not make us indifferent to conditions in our own individual life, community, nation, world. So in order for that to happen, we actually have to take measures to make sure that not only do we have the experience, not only is our experience one of reduced suffering and elevated fulfillment, but our behavior moves, is re-engineered, evolves from driven to dynamic. So what characterizes dynamic behavior is it is motivated by pain and fulfillment. It is not driven by suffering and frustration. As we evolve, we go from the somethingness of self and world to a kind of doingness of space. However, that requires acclimatization. Some people, as they get as emptiness or no self or nothingness, whatever you want to call it, as that becomes evident, some people, actually many people, probably most people, immediately love it. And it is functional. In most cases, one of my teachers used to say, a couple drops of emptiness are the best medicine in the world. It cures a gazillion diseases. However, it is not necessarily the case that for everyone, contacting emptiness or no self or nothingness is immediately a source of safety, fulfillment, love, and appropriate behavior. For some people, you have to sort of cultivate a taste for it. There's some work required to integrate it, so that it is a source of fulfillment, safety, love, and appropriate behavior. For some people, they have to go through an awkward intermediate zone where they sort of are in a flatline situation, where in some way it's sort of nice because the old gross suffering and horrific perennial agitation is gone, but the old bounce is also gone. And the edge and the motivation and the passion for life seems to have left. I call that the flatline stage. So some people have no difficulty at all integrating emptiness. It's just so obvious how it's liberating and functional. Some people have to sort of intentionally train themselves to develop the palate, the taste for it, to appreciate that it is liberating and functional. Some people have more of a challenge. You go through this flatline situation. Now, most people don't have much of a difficulty, or they require some training, but it's not a big deal. Less people have the flat line, but it does happen. I get emails from students all the time that are in that state. Fortunately, the severe end of that spectrum, so you see I'm presenting to you a spectrum of relationships to the emptiness. Or, no, a better phrase would be a spectrum of degree of challenge to integrate emptiness so that it is liberating and motivating. So there's the real easy end, and that's a lot of people. And then there's, well, it takes some work. And then there's like, takes some more work because you're in that flatline thing. And then there's the deep doo-doo end. Mm-hmm. Now, fortunately, that is, in my experience, quite rare. But as more and more people practice, then even though it's a relatively small percentage, you're going to have larger numbers of people have to face that, and that's going to be part of the shadow side of contemplative-based psycho-spiritual growth becoming the norm on this planet. It'll be a wonderful thing that happens, but hey, we have to be honest. We have to address this issue. Fortunately, all of these sort of steps, the spectrum that I'm describing, there are effective things you can do to deal with it, even the really deep end. So the deep end I call dark night. Some other people also call it the dark night. It's similar to a known psychiatric condition called DPDR. Depersonalization, derealization disorder, which happens to non-meditators. It just happens to people out of nowhere. The classic report of DPDR is I was sitting in my room and suddenly it seemed like I was no longer real and the world was flat and cartoonish and had no reality to it whatsoever. And no matter what I do, I can't get out of this, and it's awful. So the disease names the condition depersonalization. They've had insight into no self. Derealization, the world is no longer real. Disorder, and it's a bad trip. If you go to websites of people that have this condition, some of them know that no self and emptiness are major Buddhist themes. And there's one website where they say, I just don't get it. How can the Buddhists say this is the best thing that ever happened when this is the worst thing that ever happened? Yet, the great majority of people that do Buddhist practice do indeed find it to be the best thing that ever happened. So what's the difference? Well, I don't know exactly what's the difference. Someday we'll probably know. But what I can say is several things. First of all, you've probably noticed that the word mindfulness is now used a lot. It's like everywhere, which is a good thing. But now that it's everywhere, it sort of can mean anything. And so the meaning of mindfulness gets watered down and sort of generalized as it becomes a common term. That's why I'm so adamant to say that what I mean by mindfulness is exactly this. Well, people picked up on the term dark night. Now, it's gaining currency, and it's getting watered down, and now it sort of means just any difficulty that you might encounter when you meditate. People are starting to call that the dark night. Well, I prefer to have mindfulness be a technical term, not a general, hey, be aware, folks. And I would prefer the dark night to mean what it meant for St. John of the Cross, which is, and in the Catholic tradition, which is where this comes from, which is when they finally, you were born into 16th century Spanish Catholicism, and you definitely had some ideas about what God was going to be like, and it turns out that it's not quite that way. It takes some getting used to the fact that nothing whatsoeverness is in fact divine. So that difficulty integrating the emptiness of God, St. John called it the dark night of the soul. You start out and you have to struggle with your sinfulness, your selfishness, your impurities, your lack of concentration. You struggle with that. He called that the dark night of the senses. That's the beginning of the meditative path. But then if you're really successful, you have to deal with the consequences of that. He called that the dark night of the soul. So he had a lot of difficulty integrating the nothingness of God. But eventually he did. He was successful. So that, as I'd like the dark night to refer to that specific problem, rather than just be another word for, hey folks, if you meditate, you might have to face some gnarly shit, and you're gonna go through your dark night. Okay. Well, everyone goes through some gnarly shit, okay? Just living, you go through some gnarly shit. Doesn't mean you're experiencing depersonalization, derealization that you can't get out of and it's a bad trip, okay? That's a very, very different critter. Now, as I say, in my experience, it's relatively rare. So don't think, oh my God, I better not meditate because I'm sure that's going to happen to me. So there's a spectrum of challenge associated with integrating integrating the emptiness. And integrating it means two things: that it's sensorially, it accrues to an empowerment, and behaviorally, it does not lead to an indifference. So, how do we make sure that this radical re-engineering is successful? Well, I've got a lot of talks about this, but just to give you the executive summary, we're going from one kind of passionate life to another. The former kind of passionate life was driven by passions, in the sense of craving, aversion, unconsciousness, and so forth. The new passionate life arises in a different way. And if that happens automatically, fine. If it doesn't happen automatically, then that becomes part of the training to make sure that it does happen. So let's say that some training is required. Essentially, from my perspective, you do the same thing for any place on that spectrum. The person that needs to do a little bit of effort to integrate the void, the person that is flatlining and needs more effort considerably, and then the rare case of the person who is essentially paralyzed by the void. What differs is not so much the qualitative intervention, qualitative part of the intervention. What differs is the quantitative part. The more difficulty integrating, the more massive the intervention that is required. So it's a matter of amount. But in terms of what you actually do, it's pretty much the same thing. So the common situation would be the common problematic situation is not DPDR. It's the flat line. So it's like, how do I get the old bounce back? So well, let me give a bunch of tangible suggestions. This is something you can know about for your own practice, but it's also something to know about in teaching others. Once again, as mindfulness becomes more prevalent and part of mainstream culture worldwide, it will be important to be clear about these things. So let's say that you've gotten some taste of emptiness, but there's some challenge in making it integrated. So first, one thing you can do is selectively attend to what is pleasant in the emptiness. Now you might say, well, the emptiness doesn't have any pleasure. Well, that's technically true, but it can cause pleasant impact on a human. So what could be things that you would train someone to tune into if they were in a flatline situation? Well, I'd have them look for certain things. For one thing, the emptiness may carry a tranquility with it. And you can train yourself to appreciate that tranquility. And it may actually take an intentional training to sort of tune in. Oh yeah, it's sort of nice that I can touch this tranquility on demand. So that's a training. It's a development of a palate, a taste for the void. What else? Now, of course, the tranquility might not be something they're aware of. This is an algorithm. It's an interactive process that I do. One thing I ask is, okay, can you sort of enjoy a tranquility associated with the void? I use emptiness, void, no self. They all mean the same thing. Some people might quibble that they're different terms, but it's essentially the same continuum, the same critter. Okay, what else? Well, the emptiness might be associated with the disappearance of a boundary between inside and outside. And that can be fulfilling and give you a sense of expanded identity and connectedness. So I check for that. And if that's available, okay, now we're going to selectively attend to that. Instead of attending to worrying about the bleakness of the void, let's look at these factors. What else? Well, it's possible that the emptiness is associated with subtle vibratory energy that could be perceived as pleasant. So you tune into that, if that's available. Okay, well, what else? There might be a sense of sort of effortless expansion with a simultaneous contraction. If so, you could tune into that. That may or may not be present. So what else can we do? All of the things I just mentioned I call accentuating the positive. Then there's eliminating the negative. If the emptiness causes fear or irritability or any other sort of or confusion, if there's any or a disinclination to act, those are sensory events. So everything is empty, so why should I bother doing anything at all? Why should I bother doing anything at all? Is a thought now, isn't it? It's an arising in the inner system. Clearly, it is not the case that everything is empty for this individual, because the perception, everything is empty, so why do anything, ain't empty. It's a something for that person. Or the perception, I thought that the emptiness was going to be nicer than this. I think that's what John of the Cross's problem was. He was expecting, the angels and the triumphalist whatever. And instead he got nada, 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 and molte nada. Or as my people say, bubkas. So I thought it was going to be better than this. No, that's now a thought. That's not empty. So you empty out the reactions to the emptiness. Then there's nothing to get in the way of responding appropriately to objective circumstances. But now the response is not driven. It just happens. And it's powerful and it's magic. And it's progressively more appropriate. Just because you're functioning from emptiness doesn't mean that what you do is always appropriate. You'll still make mistakes, or it makes mistakes. But then it learns from those mistakes, just like the self learned from its mistake. The baby doesn't just get up and walk. It falls to the right, it falls to the left. But at some point it equilibrates. And the no-self doesn't perfectly speak in public or respond to each situation perfectly. It makes mistakes. It's inappropriate. But then it learns, just like the self learned. And if it doesn't, then you become something not very pretty. So don't let that happen. If it doesn't learn from its mistake, if you think anything you do that just happens and there's no ego behind it, and so it's okay, no matter what it is, even if you're mistreating people, no, don't think it works that way. Some people think it works that way, but I strongly disagree with that philosophy of practice. Okay, so you now are more and more arising from the situation. So your objective behavior comes out of objective reality. And if it's not right, it learns. You learn. Whatever remnant of self is there learns. The no-self learns to do it right. And to the extent that that happens, now you start to become a magic person that just walks into a situation and magic things happen, and it's wonderful for everyone. What else? Well, more might be required. Particularly with respect to making sure that the actions are appropriate from a human point of view. You may need to intentionally build certain human habits. And how you build those positive human habits? Easy. Nurture positive. You create an activity called an admirable self by training admirable human traits. Rational thought, positive behavior changes of various sorts, habitual good feelings towards people, and so forth. Well, you can build those by the nurture positive techniques. So you can use things like focus in to deconstruct the resistance to act, or the freak out that is a reaction to the void. So you empty out the reactions to the emptiness, You empty out the disinclinations to act. And focus in, deconstructing the inner see, hear, feel is a good technique for that. And then you reconstruct or strengthen certain positive habits through nurture positive. What else? Well, if the old behavior was passionate in the sense that it was driven by passions, what's going to provide the bounce for the new behavior? Well, the situation, all the things I just mentioned, plus something else. You can train your motor circuits into a quality of spontaneity. We've talked about this and done this now in a number of retreats, and we're going to be doing it at the end of this retreat if you look at the schedule. The training not of the sense circuits, but of the motor circuits to enjoy their own natural just happeningness. So you can develop a taste for what children experience directly but don't think of as an object because it just happens to them. But, children just like stomp in the mud because it's just fun to stomp in the mud. It just happens, okay? There's a just happeningness to the way a child stomps in the mud or runs here or runs there. Well, an adult, even if they're an alta cocker like me, an old fogey crapper like me, can still have that childlike bounce because the circuits are still there. It's the nature of our motor circuits to just happen. So you can train yourself to speak, move, and even think from the place of bounce. And that's what literally puts the bounce back in your step and puts the lilt back in your speech. That's a huge factor in making sure that the realization of emptiness does not make you inexpressive or indifferent with regards to the world. What else? Well, some people, and this can happen as the result of contacting the emptiness, but it can actually happen, it can be something that you contact the first time you ever meditate. In fact, for some people, the thing I'm about to describe is something they've known about their whole life. Not everyone, but some people have this sense that inside of them is a primordial black hole of dissatisfaction that can never be filled. Now, I'm stating it one way. People use different language, but there's this void in me that no matter what I try, it's just never filled. And it cannot be filled. Despite that, I keep flailing around, hoping to find something that will fill it. So not all humans have this perception, but I have found this to be a not uncommon perception, something along these lines. The trick here is to realize that yes, indeed, nothing will ever fill that hole. However, from another perspective, there is absolutely a way to fill that hole. And the way to fill that hole is not to try to do something to fill the hole, but, not surprisingly, the trick is to have a complete experience of that hole. Because that perception that there is this hole inside of me that can never be fulfilled is a sensory event. It happens in the inner system. It comes up in life. It may be lurking all the time in the periphery or sometimes come up strongly. Now, as I say, not all human beings have this by any means, but quite a few do. The trick is to realize it is an inner sensory event. It comes up in some combination, albeit perhaps subtly and nebulously, but it's coming up in the inner system. Now, when something comes up in the inner system, sometimes you can't quite pin it down in terms of image, talk, and body emotion, but at least you know it is in the inner system. And that gives you a general direction to pour clarity and equanimity constantly down into that hole. And guess what? Just like every other sensory event, it eventually evaporates and problem solved. Now you filled it. You filled it by annihilating it. And so once again, the fundamental drivenness has been worked through. So when Gary said the kind of person who can save the world is the person who doesn't need to save the world, what he was implying is a human being who has been re-engineered in a radical way. Because he was giving the Zen poetry answer, he didn't fill in the details. You'll notice that the details took a full hour to describe.